The blizzard didn't just fall. It was a total environmental siege, a whiteout that sought to erase the very existence of anything that breathed. It screamed against the hand-hewn timbers of the line shack, a tiny island of cedar and stone, lost in a wide, punishing sea of white. Outside, the world was a chaotic blur of horizontal ice and howling wind that threatened to strip the bark from the ancient gnarled pines and bury the memory of the trail under 10-foot drifts. The mountains were no longer landmarks. They were ghosts, hidden behind a shifting, violent curtain of blinding frost that erased the horizon and turned the world into a featureless, freezing void. The wind had a voice, a high, mournful keening that sounded like something trapped and dying, punctuated by the sharp, gunshot cracks of frozen branches snapping in the dark forest beyond. It was a night where a man could lose his soul to the cold if he stayed out a minute too long, a night where the frost didn't just bite, it consumed. The very air seemed to crystallize, turning every breath into a struggle against the encroaching winter, the oxygen thin and sharp like a razor's edge. Inside the shack, the rafters groaned under the weight of the mounting snow, a heavy, settling sound that felt like the mountain itself was trying to press them into the earth, reclaiming the space they had dared to inhabit. Inside, however, the universe had shrunk to the four walls of the cabin and the orange-red glow of the cast-iron stove. The air was a thick, heady cocktail of wood smoke, scorched coffee, and the sharp metallic tang of drying gear. Every timber in the shack groaned under the pressure of the wind, a symphony of wood and iron that emphasized their absolute isolation. The frost on the nail-heads in the walls glittered like tiny, cold stars, a constant reminder that only a few inches of timber stood between them and a frozen end. The heat from the stove was almost aggressive, a physical weight that pressed against the back of the neck, creating a small, sweltering sanctuary in the heart of the storm. Mike stood by the cracked porcelain wash basin, the flickering amber light of a kerosene lamp casting long, dancing shadows across his weathered face. He splashed lukewarm water over his skin, trying to wash away the grit of a day spent battling the elements, the salt of sweat, and the stinging bite of the wind that had left his cheeks raw. Every movement was slow and deliberate, a silent attempt to ground himself while his mind raced faster than a spooked stallion in a box canyon. He was bare-chested, the heat of the room turning the dampness on his skin into a veil of steam. He could feel the frost on the window pane radiating a deep, bone-piercing cold just inches from his back, a stark contrast to the searing heat of the stove in front of him. His hands, scarred and calloused from decades of rope, wire, and hard labor, trembled almost imperceptibly as he gripped the edges of the basin, his knuckles white against the porcelain. He knew Jay was watching. He could feel it in the way the air in the small room seemed to tighten, vibrating with an unspoken energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. It was a weight he'd carried for 3 years, a silent, mounting observation that had shifted from professional respect to something far more dangerous and fragile. For a man like Mike, who had built his life on being a statue of stoicism, a man of granite and silence, this proximity was a different kind of storm, one he couldn't outride, outlast, or ignore any longer. The shack was too small for the secrets they were both keeping, and the new year was coming, whether they were ready to face it or not. Jay had been sitting on the edge of the lower bunk, but the exhaustion of the day had finally claimed him. He'd leaned back against the rough-hewn wall, his eyes fluttering closed as the heat of the stove worked its magic. His flannel shirt was discarded on a peg by the door, leaving him in only his thin cotton undershirt. He looked younger when he was asleep, the hard lines of his bronzed face softening into something vulnerable. His chest rose and fell in a steady, peaceful rhythm that stood in stark contrast to the violence of the storm outside. To Mike, Jay looked like a different man in this light, less the quick-witted bronc rider who could out-talk any man in the bunkhouse, and more the boy who had once confessed, during a long ride through the foothills, that he felt like he was always running from something he couldn't name. Mike dried himself with a rough, threadbare towel, his eyes never leaving the sleeping man. He watched the way the orange light played across Jay's collarbone and the pulse in his neck. He moved closer, the floorboards creaking under his heavy weight, and stood just a foot away. The air between them hummed with 3 years of unsaid things, 3 years of shared camps, broken fences, and the long, heavy silence of the trail. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second, hesitating, before he let it rest on Jay's shoulder. The heat of Jay's skin radiated through the thin fabric, a startling, vivid reminder of how long they had both been freezing on the inside, buried under layers of expectation and pride. "Jay," Mike murmured, his voice thick and vibrating. He didn't just want to wake him, he wanted to anchor him to this moment, to this room, to the truth of what they were. "Jay, wake up. It's almost time." Jay shifted, a soft murmur escaping his lips. He blinked, his eyes unfocused for a second before they landed on Mike. The realization of where he was and who was standing over him seemed to hit him all at once, clearing the fog of sleep. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned his cheek into Mike's hand, a cat-like inclination of his head that spoke of years of quiet, desperate wanting. It was a gesture of such profound trust that it made Mike's chest ache with a sudden, sharp ferocity. "Is it time?" Jay whispered, his voice sleep-roughened and intimate. "Almost midnight, almost a new year." Mike sat on the edge of the bunk, the small space forcing their knees to touch. He didn't withdraw his hand. Instead, he let his fingers brush against the back of Jay's neck, feeling the fine hairs there. Jay let out a long, shaky breath, the kind of exhale that only happens when a man finally feels safe enough to let go of a heavy burden. For the first time in their lives, the mountain wasn't an obstacle to be conquered. It was a shield against the rest of the world. They had been a team for 3 seasons, a partnership forged in the dirt, the dust, and the occasional blood of the high country. In the world of the ranch, men were measured by their utility, not their hearts. Masculinity was a performance of silence and stamina, a rigid code that left no room for the soft or the uncertain. Mike was the steady hand, the one who knew the hidden springs, the temperament of the mountain, and the exact moment a storm was moving in. Jay was the fire, the one who could break the most stubborn colt with a low whisper and a gentle touch that seemed almost magic. They worked in a world of silence and grit, a culture that demanded a man be an island, reliable, stoic, and guarded against any form of vulnerability. But lately, that professional reliability had turned into a shared language of lingering looks and touches that lasted a heartbeat too long. Mike remembered the north fence back in July, the electric heat of their hands meeting on a scorched cedar post as they hammered in a staple. The sun had been a white-hot hammer, the smell of dry grass and dust heavy in the air. But the warmth of Jay's skin had been more intense than any summer heat. Neither had moved for a full 10 seconds, the world around them falling silent as the realization of that touch settled in. They had both pulled away as if burned, avoiding eye contact for a week, but the memory had stayed, quiet and sweet in the dark of the bunkhouse, a constant hum in the background of their work. There were other moments, too, tiny fractures in the wall they had both built. Mike recalled a rainy afternoon in a makeshift camp where they'd shared a single damp blanket to stave off the chill, lying rigid as stone, terrified of what a single inch of movement might signify. The air had been thick with the scent of wet wool and pine needles, and every time Jay shifted, Mike's heart had hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Mike remembered the way Jay had looked at him through the campfire smoke during a late-night watch in October, a look of such profound longing that Mike had to turn away just to catch his breath. They were two men circling a truth that neither had the courage to name until the blizzard forced their hand and the year came to an end. Jay sat up fully, his bare feet silent on the rough, splintered floorboards. He reached out and poured a measure of whiskey into 2 tin cups from the small table, his hands shaking just a fraction. The metal clinked with a soft, telltale ring that echoed in the small space. He handed one to Mike, their fingers brushing, a brief contact that felt like a lightning strike in the middle of a dry summer. "To the new year," Jay whispered, his blue eyes searching Mike's weathered face. "To the new year," Mike agreed. They drank, the cheap whiskey burning a trail down their throats, a welcome fire against the cold. The liquid was harsh, but it offered a strange sort of courage, a liquid bravery for a moment 40 years in the making. The clock on the mantel began its steady, metallic click-clack, counting down the final seconds of the old life. Mike set his cup down and reached out, his calloused thumb tracing the sharp, elegant line of Jay's jaw. He felt the rough stubble there, the reality of the man in front of him finally eclipsing the ghost he'd been chasing for 3 years. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder, each second a hammer blow against the silence of 40 years of solitude. "I'm tired of the lying, Mike," Jay whispered, leaning into the touch, his forehead resting against Mike's. "I'm tired of being an island in a sea of other men who don't see me. I don't want to spend another year pretending you're just another hand on the trail." "I know," Mike breathed, his voice cracking with the weight of a confession. "I'm tired too. I'm so damn tired of the distance." As the clock struck 12, Mike didn't just stand there. He leaned in, closing the distance that had felt like a canyon. The kiss was a quiet, aching relief. It started slow, a hesitant meeting of lips that tasted of whiskey and salt, and then it deepened into something desperate and bone deep. It was the end of the silence and the beginning of a promise. Mike's hands found the back of Jay's neck, pulling him closer, while Jay's fingers tangled in Mike's hair, holding him as if he were the only solid thing left in a world made of snow and secrets. The storm outside raged on, but inside that tiny line shack, the world had finally found its balance. They shared a series of soft, grounding kisses on the forehead, the temple, and again on the lips, each one a building block of a new reality. For the first time, Mike didn't feel like a statue of granite. He felt like a man who was finally allowed to breathe. They sat together on the bunk, shoulders touching, watching the embers of the stove pulse with light like a shared heartbeat. Mike rested his chin on Jay's head, the scent of wood smoke and cedar wood filling his senses, realizing that for 40 years this was the home he hadn't known he was looking for. Morning came with a deceptive silver peace. The wind had died down to a faint rhythmic whistle, leaving the shack buried nearly to the eaves in a drift of pristine, untouched white. The world was muffled, as if wrapped in heavy cotton, and the silence was so profound it felt like a physical presence. The sky was a pale, icy blue, the kind that promised a day of bone-chilling clarity. Mike woke to the shared warmth of the bunk, the air in the room freezing, so cold their breath puffed in little white clouds toward the ceiling, but their world finally feeling right. They lay there for a long time, not needing to speak, just listening to the distant, muffled nickers of the horses in the barn. It was a domesticity they had never known, a quiet peace that felt like a rebellion against every hard mile they had ever ridden. He felt Jay's hand slide over his hip, his fingers tracing the old jagged scar from a rogue horn Mike had taken on a branding day nearly a decade ago. It wasn't a clinical touch. It was a slow, reverent acknowledgement of every mile Mike had ridden alone. "Happy New Year, Mike," Jay whispered, his voice sleep-roughened and warm. He leaned up, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the center of Mike's chest, right over his heart, a gesture that brought a lump to Mike's throat. Mike pulled the heavy wool blankets higher around them, creating a cocoon the Sierra winter couldn't touch. He leaned down, capturing Jay's lips in another long, grounding kiss, the kind that spoke of a future they would build together, one day at a time, away from the prying eyes of the world. In this light, the scars didn't matter, and the years of loneliness felt like a different man's life. They eventually moved to face the reality of the day, their movements synchronized and quiet. They shared a single tin of beans and a pot of black coffee, sitting so close their shoulders remained pinned together as if any distance might allow the cold to seep back in. Every time Mike looked up, he found Jay watching him with a small, private smile, the kind of look that could warm a man through 100 winters. Breaking trail to the barn was back-breaking work, but today every shovel of snow felt lighter. They moved with a new rhythm, a silent coordination that felt effortless. When they finally reached the horses, the animals greeted them with soft, impatient nickers. Mike watched Jay lean against his big bay horse, his face buried in the animal's mane, and for the first time, the perpetual tension in Jay's shoulders was gone. He looked at Mike with a small, crooked smile that reached his eyes, a silent confirmation that the night before had changed the very map of their lives. 3 days later, the sky cleared to a brilliant, heartless blue. It was time to head back to the main ranch house, back to the world of men and the masks they had to wear. The ride down was silent, a single-file line through the dazzling, crusted snow. Mike led, his eyes scanning the horizon for drifts, but his mind was back in the cabin, lingering on the taste of the whiskey and the sound of Jay's voice in the dark. The transition was jarring, the vastness of the Sierras suddenly feeling like a cage they were re-entering. Every so often they would reach a wide, open plateau where the trail allowed them to ride side by side. In those brief moments, Mike would reach over and let his gloved hand rest on Jay's knee, or Jay would catch Mike's eye and wink, tiny, secret treasures they were gathering for the long, lonely weeks ahead. They were learning a new language, one spoken in shadows and the slight shift of a shoulder. As the buildings of the main ranch appeared in the valley below, Mike felt a tightening in his gut. The dance was about to begin. They would have to be the men they were before, the stoic lead hand and the quick-witted bronc rider. They would have to sit at the long table in the cookhouse, listen to the crude talk, the jokes about women in town, and the casual dismissals of anything that resembled tenderness. They would have to keep their eyes on their tin plates and their hearts under lock and key. It was a different kind of survival, one that required more stamina than any blizzard. "You ready for this?" Jay asked, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the ranch below. There was a flicker of anxiety in his tone, a fear that the world below would undo what the mountain had built. Mike looked at him, the man who had dismantled 40 years of solitude in a single night of honesty. He reached over, his gloved hand squeezing Jay's shoulder through his heavy coat. Then he leaned in, pressing a quick, firm kiss to Jay's forehead, a final act of defiance before they entered the valley and resumed their roles. "I can handle the pretending, Jay," Mike said, his voice as steady as the granite peaks behind them. "As long as I know you're at the other end of the trail, we'll find our moments, we'll make them." Jay reached out, his gloved fingers brushing Mike's forearm just for a second, a silent signal of their shared secret. "Lots of nights in the high camps come spring," Jay noted, a spark of hope returning to his eyes. "Yeah," Mike agreed, a rare, genuine grin touching his lips. Lots of nights. As they rode into the ranch yard, the other hands shouted greetings, asking about the storm. Mike dismounted with practiced ease, his face a mask of neutral professional focus. He took the reins of Jay's horse, their eyes meeting for a fraction of a second, a look that said everything and nothing all at once. It was a promise hidden in plain sight, a secret shared between two men who had finally found the landmark they had been searching for. "Welcome back, boys," Harry, the foreman, yelled, slapping Mike on the back with a heavy hand. "Thought the mountain might have swallowed you whole this time. You two look like you've seen a ghost." "Just a lot of snow, Harry," Mike said, his voice perfectly level, as he led the horses toward the barn. "Just a lot of snow. Everything is secure up top." Weeks bled into months, the biting cold of January softening into the muddy, gray reality of March. The ranch was a different beast now, waking up from its winter slumber. For Mike and Jay, the period following New Year's was a masterclass in the art of the unsaid. They fell into a rhythm that looked, to the outside world, like the same efficient partnership they'd always had. They mended fences, moved herds, and worked the chutes with a machine-like precision that drew praise from Harry. They were the most reliable team on the payroll, their synergy so complete that Harry often paired them for the most difficult tasks. But beneath the surface, every shared task was charged with a secret voltage. When they worked the chutes together, Mike's hand would linger on the heavy iron gate a second longer so their fingers could brush. In the mess hall, they sat across from each other, Mike watching the way the lamplight caught the gold in Jay's eyes through the steam of his coffee, while Jay listened for the specific, low rumble of Mike's laugh. They became experts at reading the micro-expressions of each other's faces, the slight softening of a jawline, the specific tilt of a hat that meant, "I'm thinking of you." They were building a world in the margins, a private history written in the gaps of their public lives. Every interaction was a risk, a high-stakes gamble against the discovery that could cost them everything. The first real test came during a trip into town for supplies. The local saloon was crowded, smelling of stale beer, damp wool, and the aggressive masculinity of 20 ranches coming together. Harry was there, holding court at the center table, and the talk was loud and rough. Mike and Jay sat at a small corner table, nursing their drinks, the noise of the saloon feeling like a physical assault after the quiet sanctuary of the mountain. "Look at these two," one of the younger hands joked, pointing toward them. "Still acting like they're stuck in that line shack. You two ever get tired of each other's company, or did you forget how to talk to anyone else?" The room went quiet for a heartbeat, the curiosity of the other hands suddenly a heavy weight. Mike felt the familiar chill of the performative mask settling over his features, his gaze becoming as hard as flint. He didn't look at Jay. "Jay knows how to keep his mouth shut and do his work," Mike said, his voice as flat as the plains. "That's more than I can say for some of you who spend more time talking than in the saddle." Jay laughed, a sharp, practiced sound that fit the room perfectly. "Hard to get tired of a man who doesn't talk, Pete. Makes for a peaceful ride. Besides, someone's got to make sure Mike doesn't ride off a cliff while he's daydreaming about retirement." The tension broke, the laughter resuming as the focus shifted to Pete's lack of horsemanship. But Mike saw the way Harry's eyes lingered on them for a second too long. Harry wasn't a man who missed much, and the way Mike and Jay moved together, the seamless, wordless coordination, was beginning to look like something more than just good teamwork to a man who lived by observation. Later, as they loaded the wagon in the dark, rain-slicked alley behind the general store, the silence was different. It wasn't the performative silence of the ranch. It was the heavy, meaningful silence of the line shack. Jay leaned against the wooden wheel, the cobblestones reflecting the dim yellow of a street lamp. The rain drummed a frantic rhythm on the wagon's canvas cover. "I hate it," Jay whispered, his voice barely audible over the steady drum of the rain. "The way we have to look past each other, The way I have to pretend I don't know the exact sound of your breathing when the world is quiet. Mike stepped into Jay's space, the darkness of the alley providing a brief, fragile sanctuary. He reached out, his hand finding Jay's jaw, pulling him into a kiss that tasted of rain, whiskey, and the desperate, crushing need to be seen. It was quick, frantic, and dangerous, an act of survival as much as it was an act of love. "I know," Mike said, pulling back, his heart hammering against his ribs. "But the high camps are coming, Jay. The spring calving starts next week. We'll be out there, just us and the heifers, for a full month. No saloon, no bunkhouse, no Pete." Jay took a deep breath, nodding as he wiped the rain from his face, a spark of resolve returning to his eyes. "A month of being human again. I can make it that long." The spring calving season was the hardest, most punishing work on the ranch. It required 20-hour days in the mud and the biting cold, pulling calves in the middle of the night, and riding through the high pastures to check on the heifers. It was grueling, bone-deep labor that broke many men. But for Mike and Jay, it was a homecoming. They were assigned to the North Range, the furthest camp from the main house, a place where the air was thin and the rigid rules of the valley felt like a distant, fading memory. The camp was little more than a canvas tent and a stone fire pit near a glacier-fed stream, but as they unpacked their gear under a wide, gray sky, Mike felt the weight of the ranch's expectations finally lifting. Out here, the only judge was the weather and the health of the herd. They were responsible for hundreds of lives, and that shared duty bonded them tighter than any bunkhouse camaraderie. One night, after a particularly brutal day of rain that had turned the meadows into a muddy mire, they sat by the small fire, their boots steaming on the stones. The air was cold, but the fire was a steady heart of heat. Mike was shirtless, the heat of the fire drying the damp hair on his chest and warming the old scars on his back that he no longer felt the need to hide. Jay was tending to a small, jagged cut on Mike's forearm where a panicked heifer had caught him with a hoof. "You're getting slow, old man," Jay teased, though his touch was incredibly gentle as he cleaned the wound. He leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the inside of Mike's wrist before bandaging the cut, his eyes meeting Mike's with a warmth that rivaled the fire. Mike laughed, a warm, genuine sound that echoed off the granite cliffs. He reached out and pulled Jay into his lap, his large hands finding the familiar curves of Jay's waist. The intimacy here was different than the shack. It wasn't just the desperate relief of the New Year's kiss. It was a settled, domestic warmth that had grown in the months between. They shared a tin of peaches, the sweetness a luxury in the wilderness, passing the single spoon back and forth as the fire died down to a glowing heart of embers. "We could do this," Jay said softly, looking out at the dark, starlit horizon. "One day, our own place, a few head of our own, a small house with a porch that looks out on a view like this. No Harry, no Pete, no masks. Just a place where we don't have to look at the ground when we want to smile at each other." Mike looked at the man in his arms, the firelight catching the fierce, bright hope in Jay's face. For 40 years, Mike had never dared to imagine a one day. He had lived in the immediate, in the survival of the next hour, the next season. But as he pressed a kiss to the top of Jay's head, smelling the cedar and the wood smoke, he realized he was finally building something that wasn't made of stone and timber, but of something far more resilient and enduring. "One day, Jay," Mike promised, his voice low and certain. "I'll get us there. I don't know how yet, but I'll get us there. We've survived the blizzard. We can survive the world." When the month ended and they rode back down to the ranch, their saddlebags were full of stories, and their hearts were a little heavier, but more certain. They were covered in mud and smelled of wood smoke and rain, but they moved with a new, quiet confidence that no amount of performative toughness could mask. They had survived the mountain again, and in doing so, they had mapped out the terrain of their own future. The bunkhouse felt smaller than it had before when they returned. The noise seemed louder, the crude jokes about town girls more grating and hollow. But as Mike lay in his bunk that first night back, staring up at the dark rafters, he didn't feel the old, suffocating loneliness that had defined his life for 40 long years. Across the dark room, he heard Jay shift in his blankets, a soft rustle that sounded like a signal, a heartbeat shared across the distance of the room. It was a reminder that the line shack and the high camps weren't just memories. They were the reality they carried within them. Mike closed his eyes, the memory of the line shack and the warmth of Jay's hand pulling him into a deep, dreamless sleep. The mountain was still big, and the world was still cold and often unkind to men like them, but for the first time in either of their lives, the trail ahead didn't feel like a countdown to the end of a long, lonely road. It felt like a path they were blazing together, one secret glance, one hidden touch, and one New Year's kiss at a time. The mountain hadn't swallowed them. It had given them a map to a world they were finally brave enough to inhabit. They were no longer just cowboys. They were men who had found home in the middle of a storm, and they knew the way back.